was this giant wave of hopium 4 months ago where finally the catastrophic Biden campaign came to a halt and they'd replaced him with Kamala Harris, and the Democratic base was energized. They were energized into wanting to actually make something of an election that they looked like they were doomed to lose. And then they took all of that momentum and then they spaffed it away on parading around Liz Cheney. So yeah, it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise that in a world in which institutions
Fucking neoliberalism
have routinely failed everyday people, that the person who wants to cozy up to said institutions doesn't get anybody to vote for them. And I specifically said in the run-up to the election, like, people kept telling me, well, no, they have some level of certainty the Democrats probably will pull this off because Trump is universally disliked and he continually has poor approval ratings as a politician. He is not well liked, that's true. But I was convinced that there was a sector of the electorate that was being missed by polling. I told you all every single time this came up in the run-up to the election. Now, I did say that I didn't know which way it would go, and we were going to be surprised by how the pollsters were going to be wrong, but I was convinced, and I told everyone, very specifically, that the sector of the electorate that Donald Trump was courting to try and build a new base, given the fact that he kind of reached his polling height in the people who already be politically engaged, was going to be young men who listen to podcasts. I told y'all, they were the people who turned out higher and who voted higher. 13 points, men aged 18 to 29 came out over 13 points for Trump, and they were missed by the polling. They were missed by polling, and I knew they would be, because they're not likely voters. These are probably, a lot of these people are new voters. And the Democratic Party strategy of tugging around the Cheneys as if that was going to win people over was always going to be a hide into nothing. Now, I did, in the run-up to the election, I thought the Democrats were going to win. I did think that they were going to win, but I had always had in the back of my mind, this is a potential outcome, because we weren't going to know until the actual election happened whether or not it would be the actual outcome itself. But I always knew it was going to be an outcome. Now, what I really want to do is debunk a few electoral myths that have immediately cropped up. They've immediately cropped up once we start talking about what happened during the election. Lots of people have immediately come out of the gates with their hot take as to how it all went wrong, or why everything was wrong, or what happened, or how on earth they could have elected Trump all over again. Loads of very quick takes that haven't really been thought through have been bandied around a lot. One thing I want to debunk, first of all, is this idea that somehow the Democrats lost because they were too left-wing or they were too woke, quote-unquote. Now, whilst there is polling saying people thought Kamala Harris was too liberal nowadays doesn't actually mean anything about policy. It really doesn't mean anything about policy. You look at all the ballot measures that people voted for in this general election cycle, things like higher minimum wages and healthcare access, all these things either got high support or went through. You know, obviously with Florida, the ballot measure had a 60% threshold and it fell just short, but there was a majoritarian support for it. And liberal, like woke, means whatever the right wants it to mean. And it's mostly about aesthetics. People don't really understand the left-right dichotomy anymore, and I can see that's why commentators like Friendly Geordies or whatever have decided to eschew that kind of language altogether and have talked more in terms of policy and say left-right doesn't mean anything. Of course, they still do mean things, but in the minds of voters, they don't mean anything. And so when they say the Democrats lost for being too woke, what they usually refer to, I guess, is this idea that, well, the Trump must have won because they spent billions and billions of dollars on ads about how dangerous transgender people were or whatever. Now, in no polling at all whatsoever, like exit polling, people who actually went out and voted, not people before the election, not predictions, exit polls of people who came out and voted, looking at people's concerns, social issues, wokeness, this was never any of voters' concerns. It didn't even crop up at all. And just how in the UK, it wasn't part of people's concerns at all, didn't even reach the top 10 in terms of people's concerns about transgender people or whatever. There's going to be a subsection of the electorate who care about it, but other than that, the main things people cared about was the state of democracy, the state of the economy, the state of reproductive healthcare, and foreign policy. The actual key indicators of the policy that affects everyone and affects normal people, rather than crazy online weirdos. Now, it didn't win Trump the vote, talking about trans people. There were other things and factors at play. And one thing that shows you that it wasn't really a huge swing of new voters for Trump that got him over the line as such. They definitely are part of his new coalition. When you look at the numbers, the raw numbers, did Trump win that many more votes? I mean, he's projected to be getting very slightly more votes than he did in 2020. Yet, the Harris campaign have lost 10 million voters since 2020. 10 million! 10 million voters since 2020. Trump basically stood where he was, took his existing base, and replaced a lot of the people who probably died of coronavirus policies that he put through, and replaced them with young men. But overall, he didn't increase his voter numbers at all, really. He's not expanded the huge level of support. But what has definitely happened is the Democrats have absolutely tanked their supporter base. They couldn't get them to the polls. Now, I think a lot of leftists seem to be thinking that policy towards Israel is like the central fulcrum of this abandonment of the Democratic Party by a lot of members of their voting coalition. And whilst I think that some of that is true, I think that there is definitely a certain sector of the electorate who've abandoned the Democrats over foreign policy issues. The idea that a large section of Americans, that 10 million of them, could abandon the Democrats over what's happening in Gaza, you're living in fantasy land. I'm sorry. The average American doesn't care about Palestinians. They care about what's happening in their own lives, and it is myopic to think that if they'd have just had a different policy with regards to Israel, that would have won them the election. That's just not true. That's just not true. Voters' main concern was the economy. It was the economy. And you know me, I've been looking at the actual numbers on the economy, right? It was a vibe session, not an actual poor economy, that caused the problems here. Look, bottom quartile wages are rising. Despite them running on an expansionary fiscal policy platform, inflation still came down relative to other countries. In fact, inflation came down quicker compared to some other countries as well and didn't reach the same kind of highs. And the big expansionary policy program came at the height of inflation. All of the warning signs about the Inflation Reduction Act keeping inflation embedded rather than actually reducing it because it's an expansionary fiscal platform, like all of the monetarists told you it would, and that never bore fruit. Right? But do you think that when voters are going to the polls, they're thinking, well, actually, when you look at my median earnings over this period in real terms, they've stayed the same, even though prices have gone up relative. So I'm going to cast my ballot in this manner. No, prices are higher. They don't like the incumbent. The unilateral artifact of the pandemic is that incumbent governments who were in charge during the pandemic lose. This has happened everywhere. Everywhere across the globe, incumbent governments, whether they're left-wing, right-wing, progressive, or reactionary, or centrist, every single one of those governments has seen either a big reduction in support or outright collapse. It's happened across the world. The ANC in South Africa, Social Democratic Party, lost support. BJP, basically a fascist party in India, they've lost support. Social Democratic governments across Europe, they've all lost support. It doesn't matter whether it was the Labour Party in Norway or whether it was the centrist parties of Germany and of France. They've all lost support in the wake of the pandemic. All of the supply chain shocks, all of the drop in living standards caused by what had to happen during the pandemic, this has absolutely destroyed incumbent governments everywhere. There was one single country that is the outlier with all of this, or I guess two really, especially in Europe. That is Spain and Denmark. Now, in Denmark, the main incumbent still saw a reduction in support, and their leader almost stepped down as soon as the election was won for them, and they managed to cobble together a coalition. And the other one is Spain, because Pedro Sanchez actually did what the socialism in the party's name was supposed to do, which was to intervene properly in the economy to stop corporate price gouging. So even with good policy that was there to be able to keep wages increasing, like this full employment economics from the Biden administration, it wasn't good enough. It wasn't enough to get people to think differently about the fact that prices were higher in 2022 to 2023. It's interesting in that Trump will probably inherit a pretty good economy, just in the same way that after all of the price shocks had gone through the system, no one forgot, even though inflation was low at the 2024 election and Rishi Sunak took all of the blame and the Conservatives took the blame. They didn't really get living standards back up because they weren't good enough intervening in the economy, but inflation was back down. Wages had risen because there was a hot labour market. It didn't help them at all. It didn't help Biden either, even though they had better reaction to what was happening with the Biden administration by going expansionary rather than contractionary in terms of budgets in a post-COVID world. And they both lost, pretty badly, the Democrats and the Conservative Party. I do think if this election was a year from now, and people had time to get used to the new prices and for living standards to rise again, because America has been growing as an economy back to where it was pre-pandemic. They probably would have forgotten the higher prices. It would have been closer. Would have been closer if this election was next year. But that's not the reality that we live in. And they're the incumbent government during the pandemic, so they lost. That's a big factor when you look at every single election kind of globally across the world, when there are free and fair elections. This is what's happened to incumbent governments. Oh, thank you for pointing out Mexico as well. Yeah, with Scheinbaum taking over from AMLO, they have even increased their support during the pandemic, again, by rejecting neoliberalism, by rejecting it. So that's something that we need to look at in terms of why people went away from the Democratic Party. And I just want to talk about what's going to happen internally with the Democratic Party moving forward. They probably will shift right. After this, they will shift right and say, well, we didn't engage with bipartisanship enough. We didn't get enough Republicans on board, even though we had someone who is universally despised, Dick Cheney, endorsing us. Somebody who, even the Republicans hate because he's a neocon warmonger. People don't want foreign wars. They don't want interventionism. They don't want to be the world police. They should have learned that in the wake of the Iraq War and the hatred of Bush, and they just did the opposite. That's definitely turned some voters off. But Sanders put out a statement on Twitter. People were quoting him and talking about his platform on TV. Like even a CNN pundit said, Sanders was right to talk about bread and butter issues rather than focusing on bipartisanship and looking competent and banging on about scaremongering about the Trump presidency, which even polling showed people didn't care about. They liked rhetoric about taking on billionaires and taking on Wall Street. They liked the rhetoric of helping the everyday average Joe. And there just wasn't enough of it. There wasn't enough of it. Like, they started off strong with the "we're not going back, stop talking about the Republicans being weird," was the Democratic Party decision to move away from the weird rhetoric and from the more populist elements of what was in the kind of Sanders-style pitch. And they focused on Donald Trump as a personality again, and it clearly failed. The DNC took over, and it was not anywhere near where the electorate was at. The era of, kind of liberal technocratic governments is not wanted, right? Fukuyama was wrong, as he always is. And the other thing as well, the other thing that hurts here too, is, well, Biden was a terrible candidate. They tried to run him and it failed. They had to put in literally anybody last minute. And I feel sorry for Harris, really. I feel really sorry for her, not in terms of her actions in government, right? But as a politician, as a political figure, her legacy is going to be the only person ever to lose the fucking popular vote to Donald Trump. And she was a new politician who didn't really have the political chops to lead a campaign so late, and had advisors who were completely clueless on the direction of travel of American politics. And she had to cobble together a campaign at the last minute. And it was the Democratic Party's decision, it was the DNC. They held no primary. There was no primary to get rid of Biden, no primary to get rid of him, even though people wanted it. There was a giant uncommitted movement, and it only took his disastrous debate performance to get him unseated at the top of the ticket. But by then, all the damage had been done. He was uniquely unpopular because of his age, and the fact that the DNC essentially rigged the system by not allowing it to be a competitive primary is a damning indictment on what could have been a chance, after he said he would only run for one term and became unpopular, to reset the Democratic Party's relationship with the electorate. What, screwing over Bernie Sanders twice, and look where it's gotten us? We've got Trump as the 47th president, when the person who really resonated with the demographics, who abandoned the Democratic Party, either through non-voting, which is probably a lot of them, because again, Trump didn't see an increase in his voting numbers, but the Democratic Party sure lost tens of millions of votes. Lots of these people just dropped out of the electorate of the Democrats, are the kind of demographics that Bernie Sanders very specifically polled very well with as an independent, which is the Hispanic community, which is young people, which is men, which is poor people, people who are from more working class areas of the country, or I guess it's more like kind of manual labour that these areas are from, trade unionists. He polled really well with these people. He polled with them in the primary and got screwed over by the Democratic Party. He kind of brought these people along in 2020 because of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force, and then Harris dropped him. He dropped him from the top of their campaign profile. The DNC operatives who want to cosplay at being career politicians and at being the natural party of government decided to drop the Bernie Sanders class politics to focus on what if we look like the Republicans. It's pathetic, and they do deserve it, and Sanders is right. And if they'd have just talked about bread and butter issues, if they'd had proper primary where people could have selected it and there was a popular will behind it, rather than just somebody that they'd thrown into the top of the ticket at the very last minute, having performed poorly in the primary originally, there could have been an organic movement behind her. But they had to try and cobble together a movement at the last minute after throwing their weight behind a Biden campaign that was never going to succeed. And they're going to learn the wrong lessons from all of this. Like, the immigration debate, it's over. It's totally over. They conceded on immigration rhetoric in this election by talking about the border wall, even though there was definitely room to convince people on this. And now that is just going to be the median position forever. It's never going back. That's not changing. That's not changing. So they can give up on that. But they can still win the economic argument, because if there's one thing to take away is not hope, I guess, because it's going to be painful, but it's not as bad as it could be. I've seen lots of people saying that there's going to be a new political realignment after this election with Trump in a second term in the White House. And if there was somebody competent at the top of the ticket, I think there probably would be. Like, I think Marine Le Pen being the president of France would definitely change the dynamics of that country irreparably. However, Donald Trump hasn't got a clue what he's doing. If you have Donald Trump and Robert Kennedy and Elon Musk setting policy in the government of America, that's going to lead to some catastrophically terrible social and economic decisions and policy decisions. And as they're not competent fascists, they're not going to run a country in a way that's going to create a long-lasting political coalition, unless they're just so brain-broken, which I don't think they are. It takes normal people to vote for you to win, just not your cultish base. You need to broaden your appeal to encapsulate both of these groups. So, he could lose these people as easy as he's won them by being a bad president. And I think that's likely to happen. I think, if he starts imposing tariffs, it'll make standards of living go down, and they'll want to search back to left populist rhetoric. I think it won't be centrist rhetoric. They'll look for a left populist in response. So there's something there. There's a base to build on. There's a campaign to be had during the Trump second term. But I don't think that's going to necessarily make its mark on the Democratic Party. The problem I have is who's next? Who does Bernie pass the torch on to? It can't be AOC. It can't be the Squad, right? The biggest problem is that the Squad, thinking that the Democratic Party would bridge the gap between their traditional supporter base and the new wave of populists in the party, have completely subsumed themselves into the Democratic Party political process now. I thought, incorrectly, that was going to be a strategy that would bear fruit. I mean, long-term critics of AOC on the left, I have pushed back on and say, well, if she's in with the top of the party, she'll be able to influence them and they'll be able to change policy. And it's clear that hasn't worked. And now her political platform is being kind of iconoclastic with regards to Democratic Party politics. That's gone. That's gone forever. It's going to have to be a new slate of left populists who are going to be able to win people over, because AOC is tainted as a Democrat now. Still have respect for what she did, getting rid of Joe Crowley and changing a lot of messaging, especially in 2020. But her time as being the face of left-wing politics in this country, that's gone. That's an opportunity completely wasted. Again, I don't think there was necessarily a strategy failure on their part. I just think that's just how it worked out, and sometimes you can't plan for these things. Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, I don't think they've got enough wide appeal. So there's going to have to be somebody new. I mean, the Democrats will probably just go with someone like Josh Shapiro, and they'll fail again, just how we always end up doing on the left broadly. But I don't see if any existing parts of the Bernie Sanders coalition have space to move into where the rhetoric is going to go. It's going to have to be somebody new. It might have to be somebody from a kind of Dan Osborne style of politics. We can only wait and see. 4 years is a long time. Tainted how? I had it in my head AOC was sort of up and coming in the party. I mean, the fact that she was popular was because it was supposed to be representative of the changing face of Democratic politics in America. Sanders was the same. They came from the same movement, and they had broader appeal because they were perceived to be outside of the Democratic Party and with progressive messaging without being linked to the dynastic and historic and kind of political insider nature of the top of the Democratic ticket. And that worked for a very, very long time. But under the Biden administration, with the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force, they decided that their best strategy was to try and get the Democrats to change from within, become friends with the people in the party, being friends with people like Nancy Pelosi, and then they could try and push policy by having access to some levers. And all it's done is ruin their reputation with the rest of the electorate, because no one likes Nancy Pelosi, right? Doesn't matter how good she is as a strategist, doesn't matter how much you've changed policy in the very small ways you did when Biden was in government. It's not filtered through to the electorate that it was you that did that, and now all they know you as is the person who's friends with the Democratic Party establishment, in a time where anti-establishment politics is what people want. And that's a failure of strategy from the left. It's a failure of strategy from the left. You look at the difference, right, between Jeremy Corbyn, who in his time in the Blair government was never seen to be part of the Labour Party's inner ring, and then in 2017 got to repudiate Blairism in its entirety, which nobody likes in this country anymore, completely repudiated it, apologised for the Iraq war publicly and said we were wrong, it was terrible that we did this, and people ate it up. People bought into this idea that our terrible foreign policy is what brought blowback. You'd never think in the UK that would be something that would resonate with voters, and it did. But he only could do that because he was seen as not having any link to the previous Labour Party government. AOC cannot do this. AOC literally cannot do this now because she is completely indelibly tied to the current Democratic Party leadership. And again, I'm not saying that this is somehow that she's terrible for it. I understand what she was trying to do. It just turned out to be the wrong strategy in the end. I don't think she could predict that everything would turn out the way that it did. Or maybe she should have predicted it, given what the DNC are like and favouring themselves and their friends and their corporate buddies over, winning elections, right? It's like the ContraPoints meme. Well, they don't want victory, they don't want power. They just endlessly want to have dinners with rich people at the top of the establishment of American politics. And you can see why their centrist messaging failed in the way that it did. Because they changed a lot of their rhetoric from the "we're not going back, Republicans are weird" stuff, which actually did resonate with the electorate and did have a way of changing people's perceptions of your opponents to at least make yourself seem credible in comparison. They then changed it to this conciliatory, bipartisan, technocratic, centrist style policy and messaging that was central to the Labour Party's attempt winning the large majority that they did gain in this year's election in the UK. Because, of course, our good friend of the show, Jonathan Ashworth, the king of the centrists, went over to America to advise them on policy. You literally saw, after this change in rhetoric towards conciliatory bipartisan governance and technocracy, you saw them use the same rhetoric that Labour had used during the election this year. We saw Kamala Harris standing in front of banners that said "country over party," which was literally like part of Keir Starmer's central pitch to the nation. Now, I think Jim is right to say that Labour are clueless as to why they actually won, and I think you're right. But there is some method to the madness in Labour doing what they did in the UK. Because, of course, we've done constituency by constituency, where swing constituencies mattered, and it's smaller, more insular parts of the electorate, they actually really, truly only had to pander to very specific swing electorate in those kinds of seats, in those kind of areas of the country. And they successfully did so, and they took away votes that they'd piled up in 2017 and 2019 in diverse urban communities, and spread them out to suburban communities where things were a little bit more malleable electorally, and they won a giant majority off of the back of conservative failure and, of course, what I was talking about with regards to incumbency during the pandemic. That same strategy was never going to work for the Democrats. It was never going to work for the Democrats because the states that they have to win are bigger. They're bigger electoral pictures than individual constituencies. So whilst Morgan McSweeney was winning votes with well-off middle-class people and losing votes amongst young people and progressives, and of course amongst a lot of working class people as well, and poor areas as well, also lost votes in there too, so did Democrats in America. Except the people they were winning over weren't key swing electorates in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, for example. It was people in safe Republican states that were never going to go blue. We saw that there were swings to the Democratic Party in Wyoming and Utah. okay, brilliant, you've won some votes there that make literally no difference whatsoever, yet you're losing votes in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, and in Wisconsin because you're not actually appealing to people who are in low income brackets or who are younger or are progressive, or indeed who have votes that could be won with populist messaging. So they lost votes and won votes in the similar demographics to Labour, but they were in different places. They were in the right places for Labour and the wrong places for Democrats. So getting Jonathan Ashworth to go and advise you on strategy quite literally might have tanked the entire campaign. So if I have to have fucking Jonathan Ashworth ruining progressivism in multiple countries, like he's just a harbinger of doom. People like Ashworth costing Corbyn the election. He lost his own election in Leicester South because of the electorate that he deliberately tried to antagonise to change the Labour Party's voting coalition, then did it in America as well. I cannot believe it. You cannot escape him. You cannot escape him. Now, people in chat are talking about how we're worried about how this is going to come over in the UK. And I think you should be worried. I think Trump being a global media figure is going to change how the rhetoric is talked about in the UK. I think we're insulated somewhat. I think we're insulated a little bit, not hugely. One thing that is insulating the UK from this, though, is that there is not a Republican Conservative Party. There's no Trumpism in the Conservative Party. There's fascism, sure, but there's not Trumpism and anti-establishment politics. The Conservative Party are never not the establishment. That's why Reform UK have seen an increase in votes, and the Conservatives have them, whilst Labour Party have been kind of at the wrong end of some less than friendly media coverage and some poor policy decisions. Reform UK have been the beneficiaries, not the Conservative Party, where the kind of populist future that we're looking at is a little few years behind in the UK than it is in the US. So the demographic, specifically that I mentioned earlier, that didn't come up in polling, that Trump really won, that I said that they were going to win and could potentially have been the swing part of the electorate that it ended up being, those people are never, ever, ever, ever voting Tory. Never voting Tory. It's not going to happen. They see the Tories as part of the establishment. They're not going to do it. They either live in areas of the country where the Tories have already destroyed it, or from a background that the Conservative Party kind of naturally don't get along with. They are, however, voting for Reform UK. But in the UK political system, there's no electoral way of squaring that circle because they're kind of shared across some constituencies and not across others, and they're just going to eat into each other's vote share, like we saw at the last election, where the Tories lost because Reform UK were eating into previously held Conservative parts of the country and also subsuming them in whole areas in the north and in Wales. So, will young men that came out for Trump as the swing demographic du jour turn to the Tories? No. They'll turn to Reform UK, and there'll be an electoral split on the right like there is an electoral split on the left in the UK. It'll make politics interesting. Make politics interesting in the UK. Looking at the Tory Reform conflict in future years, that's going to be something to watch, but I don't think it's going to necessarily be something good. What if they unite under Farage? Farage doesn't want to. Farage wants to usurp the Tories, not join them. So there are some worrying signs ahead. But it's all the more reason for us to get organised and get active and start trying to win people over. Because at the end of the day, we're the ones who have the economic policy messages that people support. All the time. All the time. We just need to ensure that we're there to be able to offer it to them. Also, given what Trump is looking at with regard to tariffs and all that kind of malarkey, and the potential that a UK-US trade deal is going to get stymied by the Republican Party, never been a better time, Jonathan Reynolds, Business and Trade Secretary, never been a better time to get nice and friendly with China. You want to get living standards better? Get some cheap Chinese cars in the UK. Whilst Trump is going to be putting up prices for Americans when they're already mad about high prices, how about we get friendly with the other side of the world who has actually got a manufacturing base there to try and get us cheap products? Want to make people's lives better instantly? Well, China have some solutions for us. I know they're bad. I know they're the bad people. Wait until the gamer's GPU prices double because of tariffs, or because of the CHIPS Act getting cancelled, right? Mike Johnson says he wants to cancel the CHIPS Act. Loads of jobs are going to get lost in America because loads of state subsidy is going. So there's the US economy is going to be an absolute train wreck. Another good reason to want to get friendly with China is that if Trump gets his way with the economy, if Trump and Musk are in control of the fiscal policy levers in America, their economy is going to tank. Their economy is going to go under. And you know who's waiting to take over as the geopolitical hegemon economically? It's going to be China. Because things like the CHIPS Act is what's keeping America competitive globally. And if they lose that competitive edge, China will take over. So yeah, good time to catch up on some Mandarin, chat. Also making Brexit look even more stupid. Also making Brexit look like a real bad decision. We're going to become increasingly isolated with a Trump presidency. Am I going to hear what Kamala Harris has said? No. I don't care what she's saying. I don't care what she thinks anymore. Again, I feel sorry for her that she was thrust into this out of nowhere, but she was a shitty candidate in the 2020 primaries when everyone hated her then, and she was a shitty candidate now. Like, imagine if she'd actually gone onto the record in the Senate that she had a good progressive record in her voting in the Senate and the platform where she endorsed Medicare for all. Imagine if she'd run on Medicare for all this time round, how different the election could have been. But no, we had bipartisanship on the border and arm in arm podium appearances with Liz fucking Cheney. Good job. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for memberships. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.